The towering stained glass windows of St. Mark's Cathedral cast colorful patterns across the polished floor. The grand hall was packed journalists, activists, and a congregation divided down the middle. Some had come to support Barron Trump, others had come to see him humiliated. At the center of the stage, Reverend Nathaniel Ford stood like a judge preparing to deliver a sentence. Tall, lean, with piercing eyes that radiated intensity, he wasn't here to talk about faith, he was here to declare war. And Barron Trump? He stood calm, composed, unshaken. His navy blue suit was crisp, his expression unreadable. At 6 feet 7 inches tall, he was a force to be reckoned with. The air was thick with tension when Ford suddenly pointed at Barron, his voice thundering through the hall. "You're a disbeliever, Barron Trump," the audience gasped. "You have no faith in justice, no faith in progress, no faith in the future of this country." A wave of applause erupted from the liberal side of the room. The conservatives sat silent, watching, waiting. Barron didn't flinch. Instead, he let the moment hang in the air before stepping toward the microphone. His voice was steady, confident. "Maybe the real problem is that you've lost faith in America." The room fell silent. Ford's eyes burned with intensity. "America? Oh, you mean the America where the rich keep getting richer? Where intolerance is dressed up as tradition? Where your father built an empire on the backs of the working class?" A few cheers erupted from the progressive side of the room. Barron tilted his head slightly, studying the man in front of him. Then, with a smirk, he leaned forward into the microphone. "Funny, I thought pastors were supposed to bring people together, not divide them." And just like that, the real debate began. A tense silence filled the cathedral. Reverend Nathaniel Ford stood firm, gripping the edges of the podium. His eyes locked onto Barron Trump like a predator sizing up its prey. The congregation remained divided, one half nodding in agreement with Ford, the other half waiting for Barron's response. Ford took a deep breath, then leaned forward. "Bringing people together?" he scoffed. "That's rich coming from the son of a man who built his career on division. You stand here preaching about unity, but let's be honest. Your entire ideology is built on exclusion. You talk about tradition, but what you really mean is control. You talk about freedom, but only for those who think like you. And now, you want to lecture me?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some attendees whispered among themselves, nodding in agreement with the pastor's words. Others crossed their arms, unimpressed. Barron remained calm. He let Ford's words settle before finally speaking. "I think you misunderstand something, Reverend," Barron said. His tone was measured, deliberate. "Conservatives don't believe in control. We believe in accountability. We don't believe in silencing voices. We believe in letting people speak freely, even when we disagree with them. But what do you and your side believe in?" Ford let out a short laugh. "Oh, please. Letting people speak freely? Is that why conservatives are banning books, censoring classrooms, and dictating what women can do with their own bodies?" This time, the liberal half of the congregation erupted in applause. Ford let them cheer before continuing. "You and your kind disguise oppression as morality," he said, voice rising with intensity. "You think your family values make you the moral authority in this country. But the truth is, your so-called traditional values are nothing but an excuse to keep power in the hands of people like you." Barron took a slow step toward the podium. His gaze was steady, unwavering. "Tell me, Reverend," he said, voice sharp but controlled, "if conservatives are the ones obsessed with control, why is it that people on your side want to control what I say, what I believe, what I do with my own money? You claim to stand for progress, but the moment someone disagrees with your agenda, they're labeled as hateful, dangerous, or intolerant." The conservative half of the audience erupted in applause. Ford's lips tightened. "That's not control. That's accountability." Barron nodded slowly. "Accountability?" He repeated the word as if testing its weight. Is that what you call it when people lose their jobs for stating simple facts? Is that what you call it when college students get expelled for having conservative beliefs? Is that what you call it when you tell an entire group of people that their values are outdated and dangerous? A flicker of uncertainty crossed Ford's face, but he recovered quickly. You call it progress, Barron continued. But what you're really pushing for is a world where only one voice is allowed, yours. The audience held its breath. Ford exhaled sharply. You still don't get it. Your father and your party have poisoned this country. You hide behind words like freedom and tradition, but in reality, you fear change. You want to keep America frozen in the past. You want to deny justice, deny equality, and call it patriotism. Barron leaned in. And what do you call it, Reverend? Forcing an entire nation to bow to your version of justice. That sounds a lot like control to me. The tension in the room reached its breaking point. Both sides of the congregation braced for what was coming next. The weight of the moment pressed down on the cathedral. Reverend Nathaniel Ford squared his shoulders, gripping the sides of his podium as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. His confidence remained, but a flicker of unease flashed in his eyes just for a second. Barron Trump, on the other hand, hadn't moved an inch. He stood tall, his gaze locked on Ford, his expression unreadable. The silence was finally broken by Ford, his voice sharper now. You talk about freedom, Barron, he said, pacing slightly. But let's be honest, your version of freedom is an illusion. A fantasy created to protect the powerful and suppress the weak. You say conservatives believe in accountability? Let me ask you something. Where was that accountability when your father's administration let billionaires get richer while millions struggled? Where was that accountability when minorities were left behind? When working-class families couldn't even afford basic health care? Some in the audience cheered. Ford's words landed like punches, his supporters nodding in agreement. Barron took a step forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Let's talk about accountability, Reverend, he said, his tone steady. Where was the accountability when your side shut down businesses for years and ruined livelihoods? Where was the accountability when your policies left entire cities in chaos? Where was the accountability when your leaders encouraged division, riots, and lawlessness, all while lecturing the rest of us about fairness? The conservative half of the crowd erupted in applause. Ford narrowed his eyes. So that's your defense? Blaming the left? Shifting the focus away from the real issue. Barron shook his head. No, Reverend. My defense is simple. I believe in letting people think for themselves. You believe in forcing people to think like you. Ford let out a harsh laugh. Oh, that's rich coming from a Trump. Barron smirked slightly. It must be exhausting, Reverend. Waking up every day believing that America is the enemy, that hard work is oppression, that success is something to be ashamed of, that history needs to be erased instead of learned from. It must take a lot of energy to be that angry at a country that's given you everything. The crowd murmured. Even some of Ford's supporters hesitated, shifting in their seats. Ford's jaw tightened. I'm not angry at this country, he said, his voice rising. I'm angry at what people like you have done to it. Barron nodded slowly. And there it is. Ford blinked. There what is? The anger, Barron said. The bitterness, the resentment. You don't want unity, Reverend. You want revenge. You don't want freedom. You want control. You don't want justice. You want power. The audience was still. No one spoke. Ford clenched his fists. You think you're so smart, don't you? Barron's smirk faded. No, Reverend. I just know what happens when people like you get what they want. Ford's voice was practically shaking now. And what's that? Barron stepped even closer, his eyes locked on Ford's. Everything falls apart. The tension in the room was now unbearable. The crowd sat on the edge of their seats, waiting for the next blow. Reverend Nathaniel Ford took a slow breath, trying to regain his composure. But the frustration in his eyes was impossible to hide. His jaw clenched, his fingers tightened around the podium. The energy in the room had shifted. Barron wasn't just holding his ground, he was winning. Ford wasn't used to being challenged like this, least of all by someone half his age. He straightened, forcing himself to regain control of the moment. "You think you have all the answers, don't you?" Ford said, his voice sharp. "You think your privilege, your last name, your wealth, none of that influences how you see the world? You stand there, acting as if you understand struggle, as if you've worked for a single thing in your life." Barron didn't flinch. "I never claimed to understand every struggle, Reverend. But I do understand that playing the victim doesn't solve anything." Ford's eyes flared. "Victim?" he scoffed. "You call fighting for equality playing the victim? You call demanding justice anger? That's the problem with people like you, Barron. You think anything that challenges your comfort is an attack." Barron exhaled through his nose, nodding slowly. "No, Reverend. I think people like you use the word justice to justify your own hatred. You don't want fairness. You want control. You don't want people to be equal. You want them to be punished for disagreeing with you." A murmur spread through the audience. Some attendees nodded in agreement. Others exchanged uneasy glances. Ford slammed a hand onto the podium. "That is nonsense. You conservatives love talking about values while ignoring the suffering of others. You defend billionaires while people starve. You preach about family while stripping away rights. You talk about freedom while passing laws that silence anyone who doesn't fit your narrow definition of American." Barron took a step closer, his expression unwavering. "You love using the word silence, but it's people like you who shut down debates. It's your side that cancels anyone who dares to think differently. It's your side that calls people evil for simply believing in tradition. It's your side that preaches tolerance while demanding absolute obedience." A tense silence filled the room. Even the most progressive attendees shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Ford forced a smirk. "You have a lot of opinions for someone who's never had to fight for anything." Barron's voice was steady. "I fight for something every time I walk into a room like this. Every time I stand in front of someone like you. Because no matter what I say, no matter how respectfully I say it, people like you have already decided that I'm wrong, that my beliefs don't belong, that I don't belong." Ford's face hardened. "That's because your beliefs are dangerous." Barron raised an eyebrow. Dangerous or just inconvenient? The room was dead silent. Even Ford's most loyal supporters weren't sure how to react. Ford took a deep breath, gripping the sides of the podium. His frustration was now undeniable. He was losing control of the room. The only question was, what would he do next? Reverend Nathaniel Ford's grip on the podium tightened. His face was tense, his breathing shallow. He could feel it, the room was slipping away from him. The once unwavering support from his audience now felt uncertain. Even those who had cheered for him earlier were sitting back, listening, thinking. That wasn't supposed to happen. Ford leaned in closer, his voice now sharp. "You stand here acting as if you're some kind of victim, Barron. But let's be clear, your family has never faced real hardship. You don't know what it's like to be oppressed. You don't know what it's like to struggle. You have no right to lecture anyone about fairness." Barron crossed his arms. His expression was calm, but his voice was firm. "You talk a lot about struggle, Reverend. But what exactly have you done to help people besides standing on a stage and blaming everyone else?" The audience murmured. Ford's lips pressed together, his frustration evident. Barron continued. "You claim conservatives ignore the suffering of others. But who's been running America's biggest cities for decades? Who's been in charge while crime has skyrocketed? While businesses have shut down? While the communities you claim to care about have been left in ruins?" A few people in the audience nodded. Ford's voice rose. "That is a lie. The problem isn't leadership. The problem is greed. The problem is billionaires and corporate elites, people like your father, who take everything for themselves while the rest of us struggle to survive. Barron didn't break eye contact. So your solution is what? More government control? More regulations? More laws that punish success instead of creating opportunity? Ford shook his head. Success? You think success is the problem? No, Barron. The problem is that some people are born with every advantage, while others have to fight for every scrap. And people like you, people born into wealth, have no right to talk about struggle. Barron took a slow breath. So let me get this straight. You don't believe in personal responsibility. You don't believe in working hard to create a better life. You don't believe in the American dream. You just believe that if someone has more than you, it must be unfair. Ford slammed his hand on the podium. Don't twist my words. Barron remained still. I don't have to. You just proved my point. The audience was now split. Some were clapping. Others were whispering among themselves. Ford's face was flushed. His authority, his control, was slipping. He needed to regain it. So he did what desperate people do. He attacked. You don't belong here, Barron, Ford said, his voice filled with venom. You and your kind don't belong in the conversation about justice, about fairness, about equality. You don't deserve to be heard. A hush fell over the room. Barron slowly raised his chin. His voice was quiet but powerful. And there it is. Ford frowned. There what is? Barron took a step closer. The truth. You don't want a discussion. You don't want understanding. You just want to silence anyone who doesn't think like you. The audience remained frozen, waiting for what would happen next. Ford's face was red with frustration. He opened his mouth to respond, but for the first time in the debate, he had nothing to say. The tension in the cathedral was suffocating. The audience sat frozen, eyes darting between Barron Trump and Reverend Nathaniel Ford. Ford's face was flushed, his composure hanging by a thread. He had debated countless politicians, activists, and public figures before, but this was different. Barron wasn't shouting. He wasn't losing his temper. He wasn't playing into Ford's tactics. He was just standing there calm, focused, and completely in control. Ford gritted his teeth. He had to regain control. He had to make Barron look like the villain. He turned to the audience, shaking his head dramatically. Do you see what's happening here? He said, voice trembling with intensity. This is what privilege looks like. A rich kid from a billionaire family telling the rest of us how we should live. Acting like he understands what real Americans go through. Some of the more radical members of the audience nodded, muttering in agreement. Barron sighed, stepping closer to the microphone. Privilege, he repeated. That's all you ever talk about, Reverend. Because it's easier to blame people for what they were born into than to take responsibility for your own failures. A few gasps were heard. Ford's expression hardened. Failures? Barron didn't hesitate. Yes, failures. Your policies have failed. Your ideology has failed. Your message has failed. That's why you're standing here, red in the face, lashing out at me. Not because I'm wrong, but because deep down, you know I'm right. Ford's fists clenched at his sides. That's a lie, he shouted. I fight for the people, for fairness, for justice. Barron raised an eyebrow. No, Reverend. You fight for control. You fight for power. And when someone challenges you, you don't argue with facts, you just try to shut them up. The audience erupted into whispers. Even some of Ford's supporters were growing restless. They had come expecting Barron to be humiliated. Instead, they were watching their own leader unravel. Ford pointed at Barron, his hand shaking. People like you are what's wrong with this country. You and your father. You spread hate, division, intolerance. Barron's voice remained steady. No, Reverend. We just refuse to bow to yours. Ford's breathing was heavy now. His frustration was turning into rage. He needed to end this, now. So he went for the lowest attack he could think of. You stand here, acting like a leader, Ford sneered. But let's be real. Barron, you're just a spoiled little boy playing dress-up in your father's shadow. Reverend Nathaniel Ford's hands gripped the edges of the podium so tightly his knuckles turned white. His breath was heavy, his face flushed. He had lost control, and worse, he knew it. The audience was no longer entirely on his side. Even some of his most loyal supporters had grown quiet. Barron Trump had done something Ford never expected. He had stayed calm, unshaken, and completely dismantled his argument. Ford's jaw tightened. He had one last move left, pure, unfiltered rage. You think you're so clever, don't you? Ford's voice was now shaking. You think standing here with your fancy suit and your rehearsed little speeches makes you a leader? Barron stood firm, arms crossed. No, Reverend. Leaders bring people together. You just divide them. Ford slammed his fist against the podium. People like you don't get to talk about unity. People like you don't get to preach about fairness. Because you don't understand what it's like to suffer, to be powerless, to be oppressed. The liberal side of the audience cheered, desperate to revive their leader's momentum. But on the other side, people watched Ford with unease. Was this really the man they had put their faith in? Barron took a step forward, his gaze locked onto Ford's. His voice was low, calm, but commanding. I know what power looks like, Reverend, Barron said. And it's not me standing here, answering your attacks. It's you shouting, trying to silence me. That's what real power is. And the fact that you can't handle losing it? That's why you're losing this debate. The conservative side of the room clapped. A few members of the liberal crowd even nodded reluctantly. Ford's hands were shaking, his face twisted with frustration. You're dangerous, he spat. Your family is dangerous. Your beliefs are dangerous. Barron held his ground. And yet, I'm the one standing here, letting you speak. If I were as dangerous as you say, why are you still talking? The audience went dead silent. Ford had nothing left. No arguments, no comebacks, no control. Then, in a moment of pure desperation, he turned to the audience and shouted, People like Barron Trump should not be allowed to speak in places like this. The room froze. The moment the words left his mouth, Ford knew he had gone too far. Even his own supporters shifted uncomfortably. Barron slowly exhaled, and there it is, he said. You don't believe in justice. You don't believe in fairness. You just believe in shutting down anyone who disagrees with you. Ford turned red. That's not. Barron held up a hand. No need to explain, Reverend. The audience heard you loud and clear. A murmur spread through the crowd. Ford's career, his reputation, his authority had just crumbled in real time. Some members of the audience stood up and walked out. Others clapped for Barron. The journalists in the room scribbled frantically, knowing they had just witnessed a defining moment. And Barron Trump? He simply adjusted his suit, turned to the audience and said, Thank you for listening. Then, with the grace of a man who had already won, he stepped off the stage. Barron Trump didn't have to fight. He didn't have to shout. He didn't have to lose his composure. He simply let the facts speak for themselves. And in the end, it wasn't Barron who looked weak. It was the man who tried to silence him. But what do you think? Was Barron right? Was Ford's reaction justified? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications.